Thanks for organising this meeting. There could hardly be a more important subject to discuss right now. I mean, let me say, I'm going to come at this perhaps from a slightly different angle to the other speakers, all of whom have made excellent contributions, which I agree with thoroughly. But I really want to look on how we can try and shift opinion in Britain, and I think broadly the same arguments apply in the USA and elsewhere, against this drive to a new Cold War, which now, unfortunately, in Britain as in the USA, has a sort of bipartisan impetus, and how we can develop arguments that will shift the dial, as it were, politically to stop this happening. I mean, we've had a lot of brilliant presentations, particularly by Loki and by Anna on the history of China. No one can say in Britain today history isn't important. We spend all our time now arguing about history and debating whether the British Empire was a good thing. Spoiler alert, this has not been debated anywhere else in the world. It's only a debate you could have in Britain, but that's all going on, and getting an understanding of China's civilizational history and also of the depredations of British imperialism in relation to China, which in fact give China a far greater basis for resentment against Britain than the other way round, should the Chinese wish to be resentful. All that is important. The political points are important as well, taking on the demonology and asserting China's rights to manage its own internal affairs at the same time as it does not interfere in anyone else's. That too is important. But there are, I think, big differences, and I agree with what Martin Drake said about this, between this Cold War and the last one. One is that China is not saying it is a model, its system is a model for the whole world. Anyone now looking at China can see it does some things a whole lot better than Boris Johnson's Britain. That's absolutely evident. Its achievements are tremendous, but unlike both the USA and the Soviet Union in the Cold War, both of which held themselves out as a model for humanity as a whole, China does not do that. And so I do not think we need to go into the trenches, as many of us did for the Soviet Union in the first Cold War, to defend every dot and comma of everything the Chinese government does. Secondly, the argument against the original Cold War was that it might lead at any moment to a hot one. That was a specter that was very, very real. The idea that the USA and the Soviet Union could actually come to a war, which would likely be a nuclear war, very, very easily. That prospect is more remote in relation to the relationship of Britain and the USA, and I completely agree. This Cold War is rooted in a desire or an impetus to try and preserve American hegemony when the basis for that has eroded substantially. But the idea of a military clash is less likely, which is not to say it's impossible. You can see things arising over Taiwan or elsewhere, but I think the argument has to be put on a slightly different frame. So I think we need to take, as it were, a set of arguments out to the British public about why a Cold War with China damages their interests. Firstly, it damages them economically. China has become, in the course of this century, really, an immense site of accumulation of capital. A lot of that has been invested around the world on a breathtaking scale, and without the accompanying interference in the internal affairs of countries where investments are made, that is of interference that's associated with imperialism. And cutting ourselves off from that, denying ourselves the possibility of accessing that in a Britain that has cut ourselves semi-adrift from Europe, hasn't got the free trade deal with America, to cut ourselves off from China, to get dragged into any sort of quasi-boycotting, and not wanting Chinese investment in the nuclear industry or anything else. That is profoundly self-defeating. It damages employment prospects. It damages the British economy. Secondly, financially, a Cold War is paid for in wasteful arms expenditure. This aircraft carrier cruising off to the Far East. Cold Wars are used to stoke up military spending, and that is a huge diversion of resources from things that could be spent much more usefully on. And China, the Chinese specter is being used with no remote security justification for a vast increase in defence expenditure. Thirdly, and I mean, and this has been referred to as well, it will stimulate anti-Chinese and broader anti-Asian racism in Britain. It will damage community cohesion in much the same way that the war on terror poisoned relations with the Muslim community and gave rise to an immense expansion of Islamophobia. It will damage our educational system because huge numbers of Chinese students are now studying in British universities. It's a cash-strapped sector as well at the moment. Cutting ourselves off of that will damage the education system as well. And then if we look at the big global problems, we cannot address climate change without close cooperation with China. That should be self-evident. It's also self-evident that we cannot meet global health challenges without close collaboration with China. They've shown they're much better at pandemic management than Britain is, and there is likely to be more such crises in the future. So I think there's a whole, as it were, suite of arguments about how this course of confrontation, which is Britain again tailing along behind a US hegemon, trying to preserve its own position in the world when, as I said, the economic and social basis for that has very substantially eroded. This is damaging the interests of the British people. So I think we need, in a way, to frame the arguments against this Cold War somewhat differently than we did against the arguments of the Cold War between capitalism and socialism in the 20th century. It's a different framing, a different environment. And I think if we can develop arguments around these points that we can take into trade unions, community organizations, and into the Labour Party. It was one of my frustrations while advising Jeremy that taking China seriously, it was quite hard to get that done. It wasn't the main frustration. There's quite a long list of there. The bar is quite high, but it was definitely an issue. And we need to make people in the labour movement and beyond, wider progressive movements, understand that getting our attitude towards China right is essential for the interests of the British people. Thank you.